And so I'll start with a story of somebody who's very dear to my heart. This is David, like 1 in 42, now 39 boys. David has autism, and one of the things that he struggles with are faces. Just recognizing social cues that we take for granted when we interact with people, he actually had to learn throughout his life. And his family just sort of recalls this beautiful story of how every evening before the family went to sleep, they sort of designed their own therapy. Basically, everybody got up in front of the bathroom mirror, brushing their teeth, made some face, and David was sort of the one to pinpoint them at. Which I thought was, this is a really beautiful example of how, learning emotion recognition in autism could go. The reality for most kids is unfortunately quite different, right? The prevailing approach in behavioral therapy is flashcards. You sort of sit there and memorize happy, sad, angry. And the problem, of course, is that the way that I smile and the way that little girl smiles are quite different. Yeah, and so unless, we're in this sort of world, it's actually kind of difficult to tell. And so, we thought to ourselves, well, what can we do to, make every learning experience a little bit more like David's? And, happened to be working on face tracking technology at the time. And so, one of the things we came up with was this idea to try to build a learning aid for social emotional learning that gives you social cues right then and there. So basically, at the time, certainly, this was, built on top of Google Glass. So let's just grab this. So you put on a pair of glasses. Yeah, they use the outward-facing camera to track emotions in people's faces and tell you how they feel right then and there. And so, of course, let me just try to show this briefly to you. What's running behind it is an emotion recognition system running a face tracker, and that can track up to 100 fiducial points in your face. Turns out you don't need that many. And a classifier that can, let's see what else we got. Yeah, so you get the idea, I guess. And so let's see, why is this actually difficult? I think part of the reason this is difficult from a computer vision point of view is that most commercial systems that do emotion recognition today, are targeted at recognizing emotions of people sitting in front of computer screens and watching ads. There's sort of a clear commercial use case for that. Whereas our setting, of course, is much more flexible. And, what does that translate into? Well, it translates into the fact that if I design you a system that's 98% accurate on the standard concat data set and whatever, that's totally fine for this sort of case. Everything washes out an average. But if that 2% case happens to be the kid's mom, it's completely useless in our application, right? And so one of the first things that we had to do when we tried to translate sort of existing, CVPR, ICCV type emotion recognition software into real-world setting was to figure out how we could quickly personalize to the individual family and how we could, recognize a baseline neutral face even in an individual. So just because, grandpa has a brow fur doesn't mean he's always angry. And so that's what, this paper tried to correct for. And so then how do you turn that into a working system? Well, of course, you don't actually run any of the computation on, your glasses because they get too warm. So, there's an app, basically, that you run the study from, that you trigger activities from. Parents mostly use the app. Children wear the glasses. And you can trigger activities from it. You can play different games. Simplest mode of it is some just sort of free play. There's other ones. There's a game called Capture the Smile, which we adopted from some folks at MIT. And then what happens is you put on the glasses, and they give you feedback. And they give you feedback sort of in the form of, hey, I'm tracking a face. You're starting to look at something. They sort of provide a cue, or if you want to, sort of like a little reward for looking at a face. And then, we've just done a ton of work with actually, bringing kids and families in and figuring out how to pilot and design an interface around this. So in this case, they get audio feedback as well as an emoji, little robotic voice saying happy, and off you go. And so how do you take something like this and turn it into a therapeutic platform that a family can use to sort of devise their own therapy? Well, you build games on top of it. So, I mentioned this Capture the Smile game from MIT. Another thing we've done is we've built a parent review. So this is essentially, if you think of us sort of tracking emotions throughout the day, we know that moment where dad got angry, right? And we know that moment where maybe something happy happened. And so we built an interface that highlights the emotions that we tracked in the video scrub bar. And so you can jump back to that moment and talk through, hey, what might have worked there, what might have not worked. So clinically speaking, we've studied this in 3 rounds of clinical trials. The first was sort of an in-lab study, which is just bringing in a bunch of kids with autism, a bunch of kids without autism, and putting the glasses on them. And they did a computer-driven test. They wore this ridiculous eye tracker, which I'll come back to later, that I sort of 3D printed, desoldered from a webcam, clipped on top of the glasses. But honestly, the main thing we learned from that trial is kids wear these glasses. And so, if you know anything about autism, that should actually be a surprising thing to you, right? So there's plenty of kids who came in and sort of said, no. Families who said, my kid has tactile sensitivities, and you can't put anything on his arm, not to speak of his head. And all of these kids basically came into our study, they put these things on, and they really embraced it. I mean, it's basically these kids decided to call them their superpower glasses. We sort of, adopted that branding. And so from there, we went to work in an at-home design trial. So there were what ended up becoming these 14 families who we recruited near Stanford, and basically brought them in and worked with them extremely closely. Right, so these sort of, basically, we called them almost every day. And basically tried to get them to be some sort of co-designers. So we would bring them in, we would give them weekly feature updates. They would actually come in and draw emojis they would like to see, and the week later we would try to put them onto the glasses and do stuff like that. And even though that was sort of an uncontrolled trial, we did see an effect on one of the gold standard outcome measures that we collected along the way. So we sort of said, okay, let's just put this thing called the social responsiveness scale on it. And so these kids improved a bunch on the SRS. And so from there, we finally went to do a large-scale randomized control trial. So I think when you're designing, a medical technology learning aid, there's sort of this tension between being a good designer and being a good empiricist. Where as a designer, a child comes in and says, this thing, it doesn't work. You want to fix it, so you go fix it. As somebody who tries to publish something in a clinical journal, no. You got to give everyone the same pill every day, treatment arm, control arm, and so forth and so forth. And so how do you unify that tension? In our case, we phased it, right? So we basically said, okay, we're going to go up to some point, and then at some point we're going to say, okay, we think this is something that seems to be having an effect, right? We get reports from teachers who say, oh my God, what happened with these kids? And we sort of believe there's something going on. Let's go try doing this in a randomized control trial. And so that's what we did. We ran a larger scale RCT. Ended up being 71 children with autism in what's called a treatment as usual control, which basically means they just get their standard therapy, and we test ours as an augmentation to that therapy. So we try to see if the kids who get therapy plus glasses do better than the kids who just get therapy, and then everybody crosses over. So eventually everybody gets to try the glasses because that's what they sign up for the study for. They don't sign up to get therapy. And so, you go run what's called an intention to treat analysis, which is basically you fit the statistical model to this that allows you to account for all of the people who drop out of the study and stuff like that as well. So if you sort of read clinical journals, that's the thing to do now. You don't want to run your t-test on the, the people who finished the trial. You want to include the data from everybody. So you train this regression, and you basically try to look for, whether there's a significant effect that's, different from treatment to control, including everybody's data. And so we did see that effect in our case on one of our primary outcome measures called the Vineland Socialization Scale. So this is a scale that's sort of, provided by parents, and that measures, basically asks them quantifiable questions about type of social behavior that children exhibit. And you do that pre and post test, and if that goes up, that's a good thing, presumably. And we've run a retention analysis. This is a little bit more difficult because we didn't have sort of a second post test. It's a little bit nuanced, but I think the best thing we can sort of say about this is these gains don't go back to baseline 6 weeks later. So in this case, in the phase 2 trial, we had these devices out for several months. In the third phase, we sort of realized, about 6-8 weeks, maybe something around that, is when we start to really see an effect. And so that was the 6 weeks was the period of the trial for that. And so, okay, so I've given you all the numbers. There's sort of more interesting design lessons, lots of kind of fun counterintuitive design lessons to learn here, where you sort of say, oh my God, I mean, these kids really, they surprise you. But maybe just as a more human side to this, what really made my day when I was running these studies was one of the first emails that reached us just a few days into the phase 2 trial. And this is from a mom who writes, we already noticed something very dramatic I'd like to share. My son is actually looking at us when he talks through Google Glasses during a conversation. And it was noticed without glasses from his teacher in language art yesterday. It's almost like a switch was turned. Thank you, my son is looking into my face. So, that was sort of the point where we really felt like, man, I mean, this sort of, that's kind of why we did that. So this is, sort of the branding that kids have embodied since then, is sort of to say, okay, well, they've been calling these their superpower glasses, and we've been equipping them with, little lightsabers on the glass, stuff like that, stickers they can put onto it. There's even been this guy who, let's see if we, let's see if we can make this work. There's been a guy who ended up, writing a book about it. This is actually this, there's this child comic series and sort of book series of this Russian author who, describes an autistic detective, and in the second series he gets a pair of glasses that can recognize other people's emotions. So, we thought it was a real treat. And so, as of 2019, we're working on an FDA path towards, basically actually commercializing this in a medical aid that, will eventually be reimbursable through regular health insurance. Okay, so I know, probably what you're thinking. Yeah. So I don't know if anyone saw this in the newspaper. So my professor took this picture, and Dan as well took this picture. Of course, he got the wrong, headline. So, isn't glass dead, right? Didn't, this guy kill glass? Right? So it turns out, glass isn't dead. I have an enterprise edition unit with me that you can sort of check out and play around with. But I think at some point you would say Google realized that this is just a much better device to do sort of specific augmented reality tasks that people who actually need hands-free information might want to do than a general consumer device meant for reading your email on your bicycle or in the shower. And so, we've been getting lots of units of these, thanks to Google for providing them, basically. This is portable to basically almost any hardware platform. So you can sort of imagine you could do the same thing with a button camera and an earpiece, essentially. And so to sort of, if you look at the system now as a summary, you sort of say, well, we have these different sensors, right? We have, we can do inward-facing eye tracking at some point. We can do outward-facing emotion recognition, tell you how people feel. That allows us to give you real-time cues, right, as sort of at-home guided therapy. But at the same time, the system, hopefully, is able to capture progress as it treats. And so we can tell, week over week, does this child look at faces more? Do they look at more happy faces and more angry faces? How is that developing? And so our goal is to turn that into feedback that can be integrated back into behavioral therapy in order to close the feedback loop and allow them to eventually take the glasses off again. And so if you think about, maybe as a larger paradigm what this does, well, we've built a therapeutic tool, that gathers data while treating for research, improving the AI in general, effective computing, and it does this interactively with the user, right? And that AI system then uses that data to adapt and calibrate as the user interacts with it, to recognize their neutral face, to adapt quickly to the fact that one family isn't behaving exactly like the different family, and hopefully to learn new tasks from that data as well. So that if one child has problems with a very specific type of social interaction, we can train a system that helps that particular child. And so that's the part that we call active learning. And we sort of believe it's sort of the future of everything. One application where you might think of this is in the parent review app, right? So we allow parents to flag a part in the video and say, here, something happened, and we would like to be able to capture this. Right? And we might not have a class for it right now. We might not have an emotion to call it, but we can start to build a quick training data set for your mom and begin to do that. So that's sort of the baby steps. Now my colleague, Nick Harber, who I've started all of this with, and is just been a fantastic friend of mine throughout all of this, has really gone into quite some depth working on this stuff, and has asked the question of how we can facilitate perhaps deeper active learning by building systems that are actually intrinsically motivated to learn. Right? So if you think about the way we do computer vision today, so this is part 2 of the talk. If you think about the way we do computer vision today, for those of you who do machine learning, you might be familiar with this thing called the ImageNet dataset. Dataset of tons of images, and we basically, train some sort of neural network by saying, here are all the happy faces, and here are all the sad faces, here are all the angry faces. Okay, now we want to learn that somebody's anxious. Well, we can't bring 10,000 anxious people into the lab and take pictures of them. That's just not how that works, right? And so to say, okay, well, this is how we learn. Stark contrast to that, how does a baby learn? Right? And so the way a baby learns is, or the way we as humans actually, learn is, through exploration, through figuring out, distinguishing animate from inanimate objects, starting to play with them and beginning to develop a sense of knowing what they don't know. And so wouldn't it be great if we could, kind of get AI to do that? And so, meet the AI baby. So Nick's been building an AI baby in a virtual Unity world. And, AI baby can move around, can do things, can make choices. And so you say, well, okay, this is a particularly insightful AI baby. But let's just think about how we would actually set a task like this up, right? More formally. Right? I think the way you would set it up more formally is you'd say, well, we have 2 models. We have a self model and a world model. The world model is responsible for understanding the world around us. The self model is responsible for taking actions. Right? So we do reinforcement learning on the self model, and and we do sort of more traditional machine learning, more sort of semi-supervised, of course, by our actions, learning on the world model. And so, how do you actually get interesting emergent behavior out of this? Well, when you train a machine learning model, you're optimizing a loss function, right? And so you can think of sort of different tasks this could do. So one of those tests is forward dynamics. The inverse of that test is called inverse dynamics. Inverse dynamics is one that tends to work decently well, where you basically say, the goal of the world model is to predict the action that the self model took. So it basically looks at the world and it says, okay, what did the self model just do? And the self model, on the other hand, gets a reward that is the loss of the world model. And so what does that do? That's basically saying the self model takes actions to try to surprise itself. Right? Like that's sort of the goal of this. And so, well, you say, okay, well, this is kind of interesting. What do you actually get out of that? Well, what you get is a baby that sort of moves around, begins to move around, and it begins to start to do things. And pretty quickly, of course, you train this whole thing as a neural network. And for those of you, familiar with training convolutional neural networks on something like ImageNet, you might know that, the first couple layers of something like this basically, correspond to standard object recognition sort of tasks, stuff like edge detectors, blob detectors, things like that. And so pretty quickly, you see that type of structure in this type of model as well. And so we've been able to learn that entirely, without just putting any type of human supervision on this. This is just baby moving around in the world. And so what you begin to see is emergence of attention to objects, right? So this baby moving around in the AI world sort of begins to say, okay, well, I need to start to move around. It begins to pay attention to objects, and eventually it starts to pay attention to animate objects over non-animate objects. And so, that's quite interesting. You say, well, why is this interesting? You've just sort of been talking about autism. Well, one of the reasons you might find this fascinating is because if you know a little bit about autism, you're probably aware that there's been a lot of literature most recently in eye tracking and psychology in general that basically showed that gaze patterns of kids with autism differ quite significantly from neurotypical controls, and that kids with autism tend to pay more attention to inanimate objects compared to animate objects quite early in their childhood. Right? And so they end up looking at faces less, as early as 18 months, perhaps even earlier. And so this is, a scale of just briefly tiny experiment of taking a bunch of kids and say, okay, you have an autism outcome measure, and you look at, to what extent do they pay attention to animate versus inanimate objects, and there's some sort of signal here, right? And so the question is, can we model this in the artificial world? And so, here's baby robot, and a bunch of animate and a bunch of inanimate objects. And if you think about this a little bit, sort of, if you're looking at this type of world, well, there's a couple, different objects moving around here. There's the type of objects that are just static, it's just sort of sitting there. There's a type of objects that have regular motion, right? It's just sort of, say, a pendulum swinging back and forth. There's a type of objects that have random motion, but random motion that's really not interesting. So think about like leaves blowing in the wind. Right? This is a very common problem with intrinsic motivation in machine learning is these models start to pay attention to random noise. It's a white noise problem. If you imagine sort of you're trying to get this model to pay attention to new stuff, and you imagine you have a room in which you have a television that sort of has a white noise signal on there, and the child will just kind of go there and stare at that television all day long. Because there's constantly new stuff, but there's nothing to learn from that. And a baby is somehow able to pick up on that quite quickly, right? And so then there's objects that do something. They're alive, right? And so, this is what the AI baby sees. And this is what the real baby sees, right? And so you can begin to say, okay, we're going to, try to build a neural model of this type of world, and we can get a bunch of, neurotypical controls and a bunch of kids with autism. We can put an eye tracker on them, and we can have them look at more or less the exact setup to try to get at this idea of, well, is this theory of mind model of animate attention like really, you know, a way to build, you know, a simulation of autism. And so, you know, this is sort of, can't get that close. You know, a first step in a series of experiments where you could say, well, you know, maybe there's a way to really start to build some physical correspondence and begin to ultimately develop better phenotyping tools, and from that, develop better therapies as well. And we sort of believe that autism is really just the beginning for that. I mean, we sort of think of, you know, what we call now the superpower glass system as a platform for human-doctor-device interaction that really provides a rich context for you know, building therapy across a variety of mental disorders. And so, you know, just corny last slide that we've been closing with always, and something just tremendously confuses people. You know, if you sort of think of us as right now doing supervised learning, and then think of, you know, what machine learning people mean when they say active learning right now, which is, okay, you know, we can calibrate quickly on mom, things like that. You know, we have unsupervised learning, right? Maybe a more primitive form of life, like beetles. We believe there's good stuff up there. So thank you very much.
Experiment with Google Glass. How long does a child need to wear the glass in order to see some therapeutic effect?
So in the randomized control trial, those have been about 6 weeks.
And how 6 weeks is the total duration?
Oh yeah, sorry.
But how long
okay, I guess 6 weeks
right.
of therapy. So this is actually, they run pretty short sessions. So this is, for the most part, parents sort of use this in a game-like setup where they do something for 20 minutes. And so in the RCT, we asked for 20 minutes 3 times a week with the family, once a week with the behavioral interventionist. Mm-hmm. In reality, they did about half that. So it's not a ton of stuff.
Okay, so you think that the duration is short enough such that there's no negative effect on the development of the child's eye? Because that's one of the concerns about putting a screen very close to the child's eye, right?
Yeah, it's sort of, I mean, you have different parents and people who have different beliefs about this. We sort of, you know, rely on hardware that's been, you know, FCC regulated and tested and built, and sort of make sure that there's no way that you have, you know, wavelengths and mostly, I guess, amplitude of light that would be damaging to an eye sitting there. I mean, that's sort of, you would think that they figured that part out, but certainly, I mean, every once in a while we find a family that is concerned about that. I'm not particularly worried about it, to be honest.
Right. So one of the things about, like, there are some other attempts of using VR goggles,
yeah,
right, to treat autism, right? And one of their concern is that most of VR goggles are age limited to 13 or above.
Yeah.
Right. If you look at Oculus, right, there's a label on this as 18.
Yeah.
13 or above. Sorry, 13 or above. Right.
Yeah, we had a long discussion with Google's lawyers.
I'm sorry?
We had a long discussion with Google's lawyers about that. I mean, they of course also put, you know, 14 on that or something like that on the glasses to begin with. You know, I think part of the idea here is, unlike VR, we don't enclose your entire field of view and you're staring at a screen.
Right.
You're supposed to, you know, look at the person in front of you, and within your peripheral field of view, we sort of, you know, give you a clue that alerts your attention.
Right. So the effect is maybe less.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Thanks for a great talk. My question is the mechanism that you think this thing is working internally. Is it the autism person with autism is actually being trained the way they're looking, because they're being shown the emotion that are being perceived, right? If someone is, you know, laughing, you show them exactly the same laughing, you know, animation. Is there any clues in terms of how this thing is working? Because I assume if someone with autism, they might have difficulty even understanding the emotional phases, right?
Yeah, well, I really can't pinpoint a mechanism of action here, to be honest. I mean, there's sort of, you know, there's a step of recognizing the emotion, and there's a step of smiling back. I fundamentally believe that, you know, you have to enable the first to enable the second. But if you think about this learning aid, I am not entirely convinced that it is fundamentally the emotion recognition that's sort of training them. I mean, there's plenty of kids who, autism wide spectrum, and there's plenty of kids who feel very comfortable with telling, the Ekman 8 basic emotions. But somehow this does something for them that makes their parents say they make more eye contact. And so I wonder if for those kids, it's not maybe sort of, the fact that we're alerting them to the saliency of emotions in faces. It's sort of, they put on the glasses, they look at somebody, a green box lights up, and as they start to talk to you and as they start to interact with you, emojis pop up and alert you to the fact that there's something interesting for you to see in that face. And, that's sort of another hypothesis where you just say, well, really, this starts a conversation around emotional interaction in that family. And unfortunately, we don't have a good placebo control to have for me to make any scientific claims about that.
And my second question was regarding the reinforcement learning. What is some sort of implicit reward or loss that you get from a real-time scenario? Because I assume you don't want to actually annotate the data sets, right?
Right, so the loss in this case, people have come up with better ways of trying to model this white noise problem, but if you imagine the sort of simplest case is you give it a discretized version of, the reward becomes a discretized version of the loss of the world model. So for example, if you do inverse dynamics where the world model is trying to predict what action the self model took, then the reward to the self model is high loss from the world model. In other words, it's trying to make the world model fail.
If you categorize each one of the categories, something like sad is a one category, happiness is a one category, how many samples in each of the category did you get actually?
Is asking how many samples do we have in our training data?
Yeah.
Oh boy, right now. So I think it's a little bit of a tricky question to answer because some of the training data is discretized video. And so, it's sort of, okay, I can, depending on how high frame rate of camera I choose, I can make lots of frames doing this. But an easy answer is, I think somewhere around 1 million total, so divide that by 8, you get
so
per
for
category.
Each of the category?
Mm-hmm.
Oh,
but divide by 8.
It
so like 150,000 frames or something like that for the base model. And then we collect data on the individuals.
Sure.
Yeah.
I have 2 general questions.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, thank you for your presentation.
Thank you.
And when you're doing the presentation, I'm thinking, is there any device that can monitor my emotion, not like a Google Glass? I want to know to check down all of the day what I might react to everything. Like, this is the number one.
So I think there is one, right? And it's
cell phone.
Called your cell phone, which is, there's been loads and loads of studies now that show that we look at this thing, like 1,000 times a day or something like that?
That's
I mean,
right.
it's just
hours.
too much. And most of the stuff we're reacting to also gets to us through this thing. Right? So it's sort of most good news and bad news comes to us right here. People who can really deal with that are Samsung. But there's companies now working on that, basically saying, you should be able to get the quantifiable health score out of that, especially once you calibrate it to an individual, and especially now that we have, good low power cameras, and basically every time you pick it up, you should be able to get an impression.
Yeah, makes sense. And another question is, do you think the emotions are universal? I mean, everybody's, when they say sad, they look the same. How the face reaction to that, your algorithm, or do you think you're gonna personalize, or each person is different? Do you want to machine learning, like personalize your algorithm?
Yeah, I think everyone's different. I mean, there's sort of this, Paul Ekman is the psychologist, TV lied to me guy, who came up with this idea originally of saying, there's these 7 fundamental, universal, basic expressions like happy, sad, angry, fear, surprise. You can say, contempt, neutral, disgust. The sort of, okay, we're up to 8, right? Yeah, exactly. I mean, I would say not just disgust is different. I would say they're all quite different. And I mean, certainly, they're quite different amongst parents of kids with autism, right? I mean, it's no secret that there's a genetic link in autism. And so, we had a lot of fun getting, a dad of a child with autism to smile into our computer. It's just, make a happy face. So, our fundamental philosophy is that if mom's angry face is, then that's when the thing should say angry. Because that's what the child needs to learn in that particular case. And we basically have them use them exclusively at home. So we try to calibrate to that.
Just a quick question. So
sure.
In your last slide, you mentioned that you're going to FDA approval? Or
we don't have any FDA approval.
No, but you once that you are going to
hopefully
try to gain FDA approval, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Do you have a time frame on that?
Oh boy, 2019. I mean, so what I can tell you is we're going for what's called an FDA breakthrough clearance. That's our target.
I'm sorry, what is it?
It's sort of a breakthrough path, which is basically an FDA designation that if you are successful in getting it, the FDA decides to sort of work with you closely, gets you direct in, and help you get your classification more quickly. So we're trying to accelerate that as much as possible. I mean, I think the shortest possible it could be is 6 to 9 months.
Okay. All right.
So were most of the experiments dealing with like more positive emotions like happy, or were there like a mix of like positive and negative, like things like angry, yuck, scared?
There's a mix of positive and negative. So I mean, there's in free play activity, you just do whatever you want. You play a game, you play charades, you do something like that. It's whatever you end up portraying. In our game, in this capture the smile game, it was sort of this guess the emotion game. The child gets like a little prompt, and it's just sort of glasses talk to you and say, find a happy face, find a scared face, find an angry face, and so that was a mix.
Okay, like was there ever a situation where they'd be upset by like a negative emotion, or?
I mean, anecdotally, I can't really recall anything of sort of, ultimately it is play, right? Mm-hmm. So it's sort of, I think there's an awareness that this has been, that you're doing this in order to learn something. There was one child that commented that he thought the glasses sort of provided a shield from whatever he was. I wasn't sure how to feel about that. Sort of this idea of saying, okay, it's this thing in front of me, and through it, I can look at other people more easily. And so for him, maybe that felt like a protective thing.